This is the Constructionist Podcast, where we take ancient stories, the person of Jesus, current events and topics, and help you construct a new Christian worldview that's relevant and loving to those around you. I'm your host, Kevin Bates. I'm a semiotician and community builder, looking at the signs of the times to build a better future together. You are tuned into the Constructionist Podcast, and tonight we are continuing our now 10-part series on the body, constructing a new you. So tonight's topic is on mental health. It's our mini-series, and this is part 2 of 2 parts. So if you've missed last week, please go back and listen to that after you listen to part 2, and we'll be discussing how mental health affects our lives, affects our mind, affects our spirit, also affects our body. So our guest tonight is Tiffany Russell. She is a licensed school psychologist for a local district here in the Portland metro area. And it's important to note that this podcast is separate from her work at the district and does not fully represent the policies set forth by the state of Oregon. So rather, our focus tonight is an open discussion about children's mental health and mental health in general. We're going to look at early age detection of mental health and also treatment options for children. So as hosts, we want to make it clear that we're not professionals or practitioners in the realm of mental health or psychology. Our aim is to just facilitate an honest and informative discussion on this important topic. This is an important topic and dear to my heart since I have struggled with mental health in my life as well. And many of my friends and the people that I'm connected with do. It's not a hidden topic, and it's something that my friends and the connections in my community that I have, we like to talk about it openly because we find it healthy to help one another find the resources that we need. And so our Our commitment and also our encouragement is that if you are struggling with mental health issues, or you just perceive that you need help in some way when it comes to your mental health, we want you to go to a licensed counselor. And so somebody that is a licensed practitioner in the area of psychology, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a licensed counselor in your state, we want to encourage you to connect to one of those professionals for your mental health. So as constructionists, we are the Constructionist Podcast, and our goal is to equip you with the tools to create a relevant and compassionate worldview that can guide you through your life. So an important part of this is making sure that we take care of ourselves first. And so it would be very difficult, and we can't really love in a whole way if we're not loving self. And it can be very difficult to extend care if we're not caring for self. So we highly recommend that we would take care, self-care and mental health care, physical care, nutrition care, all the topics that we've talked about in the body. We want to encourage you to do this in your life. We want to recommend a TED Talk by Dan Harris on TED.com. His name's Dan Harris. The title of the TED Talk is "The Benefit of Not Being a Jerk to Yourself." We find this to be a powerful and insightful talk that explores the topic and importance of self-compassion and its positive impact on your mental health and well-being. It's a valuable resource. It's a quick 20-minute listen. And so we want to encourage you in your journey of self-care, and maybe just that video or some resources that we give tonight would be helpful for your personal growth. So in previous podcasts, we've talked about this idea that if we deconstruct old ideas, or if we break down, let's say, old thinking or understanding, it's all too easy to fall back into old patterns and behaviors, ultimately ending up in the same place that we were before. So that's why we believe that it's important to create a new framework, a new vision, a new pathway forward, a new guide to help us break down old habits and toxic behaviors and create new positive habits in our life, something fresh, something constructive to hold on to as we move forward. I think without it, we run some risks in falling back to poor or bad mistakes, or perpetuating harmful patterns. So this is our thinking space. This is a place where we just get together and talk about things that we find important. We think that the world of mental health is an important exploration, an important journey that we need to be open about, and just transparent and vulnerable when it's safe to do so. And so we like to share ideas and thoughts in this realm. And today we're striving to just articulate practical thoughts, maybe a little practical theology, practical ideas that would help us in our daily life. So in the last 10-part series, we have covered these topics so far. First is goal setting, habits and toxic behaviors, self-concept and beauty. Fitness and nutrition was a 2-part series with Stacy Cannon on Cipher.life, if you want to connect in to what she offers. Spiritual practice and meditation, healthy relationships, a 2-part series. This is the second one on mental health. And then the all-important neglected rest and recovery is going to be our last podcast next week. So note to our supporters, first and foremost, we want and we find it important that you engage with us, interact with us, ask questions, maybe on the social media channel that you're listening to, in the chat box, in the comment section. You can interact with us, and that way it'll automatically pop up. So you're listening live tonight, those will automatically pop up. We'll be able to answer those questions. And we want you to ask questions tonight. And we want you to ask bold questions tonight. Just ask us anything. And Tiffany's here to help us guide through those questions, to give responsible answers from a professional's perspective. Also during the week, if you're listening to this off of Thursday night, during the week, we attempt to answer all the questions that are asked throughout the week as well. If you want to financially support us, you can go to resonatelife.org. That's going to be provided in the chat box as well. And go to the Give tab. That'll take you to a Give site where you can financially support us so we can provide valuable content like this in the future. So, mental health, part 2. That's where we're at. I just want to address something really important. Since I'm a pastor in the local community here in the Portland metro area, I can speak on behalf of my profession and also my perspective when it comes to faith communities and leading a faith community myself, and also being in the faith communities that I've led in the last 25 years. The church has not done a good job in addressing mental health. We really have not. We haven't done a good job in promoting professional mental health or encouraging people to enter into a journey of counseling. We just have not done it. We've had bad theology. We've had theological practices where we've actually told people things like, if you would just pray harder, you can overcome depression. If you would just pray that the devil would leave you, like you had some demonic oppression or possession in your life, that the mental illness that you have is like a demonic spirit inside of you that needed to be cast out. Or if you were suffering from depression or any mental illness in general, it was common to say that you didn't have the fullness of Christ in you. Those kind of statements are toxic. They're absolutely wrong. We don't support them at all. They're unhealthy. And on behalf of all the pastors, if I could say I'm sorry, I know that I can't say I'm sorry for everybody, but the way that we've behaved around mental health has been completely inappropriate. I don't find it biblical. I don't find it philosophically healthy. I don't find it culturally good. I don't find it just being a human being to another human being. It's not loving to look at another person and not encourage them to go to a licensed professional counselor, or to um, or to even maybe they needed medication, so to go on an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety. There's been so many things that the church has done and have promoted. I know a pastor that got up in front of a bunch of people and said, you don't need to take your antidepressant or anti-anxiety drugs, go off of them now. That's dangerous. If anyone ever tells you to go off of your antidepressants, anxiety, or panic attack medications, please just walk away from that session. Walk away from that voice. That is not what you need to do. There's licensed professional people who can guide you through medication, counseling, and therapy and help. So mental health. So I just needed to just give that caveat, as that's my profession and my professional opinion, that we need to promote professional help in mental illness care. So mental illness is one of the most common health conditions in the United States. These statistics I gave last week, I'm going to give them again. 1 in 5 Americans experience mental illness in a given year. 1 in 5 children, either currently or some point in their young life, have a serious debilitating mental illness. And Tiffany is going to inform us about some experiences that she's had. 1 in 25 Americans live with a serious mental illness, such as bipolar disorder, a clinical depression, or even schizophrenia. 1 in 25 Americans in the United States. So if you start doing the math on that, mental illness is a part of our culture. It's a part of our communities. It's in our homes. It's in our families. It's in our churches. It's in our workplaces, and we need to take this seriously. Another thought is there's not one single cause to mental illness. It's very dynamic. There's a number of factors that contribute to either the risk for or the actual mental illness. And so early experiences, of course, trauma and PTSD, and early history of abuse, child abuse or sexual assault, or witnessing violence of some kind. Experiencing medical conditions, ongoing chronic illness and disease like cancer or diabetes, some biological factors like chemical imbalances in the brain, serotonin levels and such. The use of drugs and alcohol can affect our mental health, and having just isolation. So we saw a lot of mental health emergence out of COVID isolation. And so isolation and loneliness, or too much aloneness, you can have feelings, and those feelings can turn into depression. So one thing that I do want to mention, though, is the challenge with mental illness, especially in our United States of America, where we have this American dream that everything's supposed to be happy, happy, joy, joy. that mental illness has a stigma around it. We don't want to talk about it. People are afraid of it. People think you're weird when you have it. People think you're wrong. People tell you to get over it. People say all kinds of things, and that is called stigma. Stigma can be summed up in 3 words. We stereotype the illness. That leads to prejudice in our beliefs about the illness, and that leads to discrimination or action of the illness. So we have this idea about the illness, usually uninformed, completely irresponsible, which leads us to start treating people a certain way, and we have a stigma. So a good website to go to is stampoutStigma.com. StampoutStigma.com. We'll support them, not financially, but verbally. We're not getting anything for promoting their website, but they do have some good resources about how to stamp out all kinds of stigma, stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminations, especially in the realm of mental illness. All right, enough of me, because we brought on a special guest. Tiffany Russell is a licensed professional school counselor in our local area in a district. Again, what she's going to say tonight is not connected to her work in the district. It's totally independent and her own thoughts. And so we are very excited to have her with us. And our first topic that we're going to start talking about just openly is, what is mental illness? And how do we identify it? What causes it? Let's talk about early detection. So Tiffany, tell us generally what your thoughts are on mental illness in general, but also what is it and how can we identify it?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And thank you for apologizing on behalf of the church.
You bet.
Yeah, so we'll get into that later. But so just like you said, there are many causes for mental illness. Genetics play a huge role, physical trauma, psychological trauma, brain injury, and then environmental factors like poverty, racism, discrimination, being in an active war zone, things like that that are environmental. It's important to note that just because these things have happened to you doesn't mean that you're destined to become mentally ill. But there are factors in the likelihood that you
Yeah.
will develop a mental illness. And for children, um, detection of mental illness, there more and more research is being done on young children, because back in the 80s they said that a child couldn't be diagnosed with a mental illness until they were 7 years old, and they're diagnosing children with serious mental illnesses now at the age of 1.
Wow.
So it's rare. Um, it's it's rare to have a mental illness as a young child, but it's even more rare to be diagnosed, because
Like,
a 1 year
So
old.
why 7? Like, what's the 7? What was that
I
delineation
think
there?
I think that they thought that children weren't able to think for themselves until that age. Um,
Okay.
which
object
sounds,
permanence, or what is, I
yeah,
forget
it,
the.
that's the developmental stage of early childhood. Um, but like, goes along with like rationalizing thought and things like that,
what
cause and
what
effect.
what would be like a standard diagnosis for a mental ill child at the age of 7? Like, you're talking about like chronic depression, bipolar, like
Yeah,
what?
I think most common would be depression and anxiety.
Okay.
Um, they're finally they're talking about having ADHD not be part of a mental illness category, but it still is.
Mhm.
It's a neurological disorder, and in my personal opinion, it definitely seems more like just a different ability, um, instead of a disability. But um,
My friends
I'm
Yeah.
call it their superpower
yeah.
because they can think in all these realms. Let's talk about that a little bit, because
Yeah.
we want to make sure that we're delineating
Mhm.
between mental illness and neurodivergence, and explain what neurodivergence is first, and then like kind of bounce back and forth. Like, how can we delineate between the two?
Yeah, so neurodivergence is just someone's brain that works in a different way than is typical, and typical is very relative, right? So
Right.
um, so we, the group of doctors that decided on this disorder of, let's say, autism or ADHD, they decided that the brain isn't working correctly. But what we're really finding is that it's just working in a different way than is
Differently. Yeah.
typical.
Mhm.
And so that's what neurodivergence means, is that your brain is working in a different way than what would be considered typical.
Yeah.
So autism is neurodivergence.
hmm
Now, mental illness, depression, autism, and being autistic can lend itself to being depressed as well. Somebody with autism can be depressed, but it's not necessarily the cause or
Yeah,
directly related. Yeah.
So mental illness is when a person experiences a significant change in thinking, emotion, or behavior.
Mm.
So a child with ADHD has likely had that brain chemistry when they were born or soon after, and same with a person with autism. They've likely had those neural pathways in a way that is different from a typical child, meaning that it's not a significant change in
After they're
behavior.
vaccinated, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, we're not going to talk about that.
Um,
Oh,
would
boy.
you say that being neurodivergent is a contributing factor when it comes to mental illness because the world isn't necessarily built for you?
Yes, in exactly the same way that people in the LGBTQ community are 47% more likely to develop a mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
not because of their gender or sexuality, but because the
Right.
way the world treats them. So yes,
So that'd be
exactly.
more environmental.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Same with
So-
racism, same with oppression, same with poverty. Poverty doesn't cause mental illness, but the way that you have to interact and work
Mhm.
and stress in the world can cause that mental illness.
Yeah.
So not to get too technical, but I've read some things on ADHD that it's a lowered executive function of the brain, which is because of an underdeveloped section of the brain. So if it's an underdeveloped section of the brain, that what we used to call the reptilian brain, I'm not sure what it's called now, but we used to call it that, the reptile brain, our executive function. So that would be neurodivergence in a traditional form.
Mhm.
Yeah, because you just don't, that doesn't happen just because of external factors.
Mhm.
Yeah. Was there a
So,
question?
so with somebody with early trauma, like anxiety, so I'm in the adoption realm because both of my children are adopted and they have adoption trauma. So that's very easily any child that goes through a trauma, it's very easy to see adoption trauma. So what are some signs of children, because we have, sexual abuse, we have traumas of all kinds when it comes to children, violence at home, neglect from parents and caregivers of the children. So what are the early signs of a child that we can see that they're actually developing a mental illness? What have you seen?
I think definitely that big change in behavior. But parents and caregivers really have to be careful about ruling other possibilities out.
Okay.
So, what I mean is, like, during the snow day, my 11-year-old was on Minecraft for about 24 hours because I was working.
Right.
And after that long period of time on a screen, he was acting insane. So that's a big change in behavior, but it's not because he's mentally ill. There was a factor involved.
Okay.
So kind of have to tease those out. Like, um, just because a child is being abused doesn't mean they have a mental illness. So if
Mm.
you feel like your child is behaving differently, then you might want to explore the causes of what that could be. So asking questions, observation, being very like strategic about um, what media they're exposed to, what friends they're exposed to, whose homes they're exposed to. So kind of making sure that there isn't those external factors impacting their behavior or their emotions. And then if it's not, then you might ask questions to your pediatrician like, hey, is this something typical for a child, a 5-year-old, or is this something typical for a 3-year-old to be experiencing? So getting feedback from professionals is definitely something that I would recommend.
Yes, and so as while it's easy to maybe that's not a good word to use. Maybe a little more clear to look at a child with neurodivergence, that they're not developing in a certain area as fast. Maybe they're not talking, walking, or motor skills are not happening according to the charts. But when it comes to mental illness, what you said, teasing out these, like, okay, what is happening in the world, and why is my child like reacting to this? Because I'm sure in the school things happen all at once, and so all of a sudden you have 100 kids that are experiencing all of this, craziness, because they all like took 3 days off of school and now they have to go back to school, and they're all like angry about it or whatever, versus the one child that comes to you and they're just like dealing and crunching through their emotions.
Yeah, and I think for parents also, just like when we see adults with depression or anxiety, just not being able to get through their normal activities, becoming really fatigued for no reason, having like somatic symptoms like a lot of tummy aches and headaches, and not being able to sleep, things like that. Those are all like early warning signs that something probably isn't right, and warrants further exploration of symptoms.
Right. Genetics. You brought up genetics. Tell me about that. Like that brings up, okay, my dad was depressed, therefore I'm depressed. My mom has schizophrenia, therefore I have schizophrenia. I mean, like, my mom was borderline. Do I have borderline? Like, is that a real thing?
Mental health or mental illness can be genetic, but it's not. There's not enough research right now that shows direct correlations in like gene sequencing and things like that. But um, whenever we do intakes, and whenever we're exploring treatment and diagnoses, we're always asking parents about their own mental health history, and their whether it's on the maternal side or the paternal side, because certain disorders are passed down through different sides of the family. More commonly, not it's not a guarantee. Like I said, it's, if your mom was borderline, it doesn't mean you're going to be. Just like if your mom is an alcoholic, it doesn't mean you're going to be, but you're definitely more likely to be.
Yeah.
And you also have the environment of growing up around that mental illness. So that's a factor as well. By the time you're 12 years old, being around a borderline parent, you're something.
You're either on
either you're wanting to move
codependent
out or
side
something's going on.
Right. And that's not necessarily because your mother had a mental illness. It's because the environment that you are raised in, and your attachment and all that of that was correlated, and now you are trying to make meaning of that.
Yeah, so attachment style. You actually brought this up in a different topic in a private discussion I was having with you about something completely different. But attachment style, we have a secure attachment, we have avoidant avoidance attachment.
Mhm.
What are the other attachment styles?
Disorganized.
Anxious and
Anxious
disorganized.
and disorganized. So disorganized is the one that is most often related to traumas and connected to trauma, but anxious and avoidant can be
Avoidant.
as well.
Mhm.
But there's different behavioral patterns. We just want to encourage people, if you don't know about attachment style, that's a whole nother discipline, whole nother study that you
Yeah.
can get into about attachment style. But there's some great resources on websites like psychology websites that actually
Yeah.
have real data attached to them.
Right.
You know, you're not Dr. Google. Don't go out there and just look at everything and anything.
Yeah. You
Um,
can a good place to start would be just Googling John Bowlby or Mary Ainsworth. They're the attachment experts.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
okay.
just, you know, just look up
Can
those names and you'll find a lot of good stuff.
say those
So you,
names one more time.
John Bowlby and
Bolby.
yes, and Mary
Okay.
Ainsworth.
Mary Ainsworth. Okay.
so you talked about noticing patterns, I should say, and then teasing out if those are environmental, if those are situational, and once you determine that those are not situational, like something happened,
Hmm.
what is the next step in determining the mental health of a child at that point?
Yeah, so depending on the age, I would definitely reach out to your pediatrician first. A lot of times they will then rule out any like physical factors,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to like the somatic complaints. They'll look at GI issues and things like that, because a lot of children don't know how to explain anxiety or depression,
Yeah.
or other mental illnesses. So it's a lot of ruling out in observation.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, talking to your pediatrician. I have found that some pediatricians will be very dismissive, um, and
Mm,
then you find a new pediatrician,
okay.
because you are the parent or caregiver, you're the expert on that child,
Yeah.
and if you feel like something's wrong, then something's
Mm,
wrong, and it could end up that it's you, and you are just like very anxious and worried, but you're gonna find that out through
Yeah.
through a professional,
Yeah.
and then you can get help
mhm.
for that. So, um,
But there's not
but
like a multi Minnesota multifaceted personality inventory for kids, right?
yeah, there is several inventories based on age. A lot of them start around age 6.
Hmm.
There are some that are like preschool age, 2 to 5. Um, but
Wow.
again, it's mostly um, parent or
Observation.
caregiver input and observation.
Got it.
So let's move on because we just talked about question one out of 10. Let's we have a list of questions that we're going to try to get through. And I don't want to race through them, but maybe some of them will be more easily answered, and then we can go back to some of these other topics. Do you, when you sit with a child or you sit with a parent and a child, in your situation, is in school that takes up, at least in my children's lives, it takes up a lot of time during their day. They have access to resources in
Mhm.
that school, and in our school district it seems like that there's quite a number of resources, always underfunded, always understaffed, but there's a lot of resources in my children's school district. And what is your approach, like when you, is it, so you just start sitting down with a child and they start telling you things and it's talking like a cognitive behavioral talking back and forth? What's your approach to teasing out these things in children? What do you say to them, or what do you do with them?
Yeah, so I have a few favorites, depending on the situation and the appropriateness of the case. I do use CBT a lot, cognitive behavioral therapy, because it can be used in as a brief solution focused approach.
Mhm.
We talk a lot in schools about goals. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we are wanting to have the child, and if the child's not old enough, the caregiver, the teaching team, whoever's working with that child, to kind of find a goal and work toward that goal. And if the goal isn't working, we invite the team of people to disregard that plan and come up with another plan.
Hmm.
So that's what I use a lot of the time. I also work using dialectical behavioral therapy, which is DBT, and that is used primarily in the schools with kids in crisis, because we talk a lot about distress tolerance and figuring out a way to distract from the crisis so that we can move on and find different coping skills. But so we use that. My team uses that with like kids that are suicidal or kids that have made threats. So pretty kind of high level crisis situations. And then with the
And
little guys, I really
before
sure.
you move on from that, before we go to the little ones, DBT, unpack what DBT is, because a lot of people know what cognitive behavioral therapy, talking therapy. When we go to our counselor, we're sitting there, you lay on a couch, hopefully not, but you know, the old the old psychology, you know, your therapist is sitting there talking to you, unpacking your brain. What is DBT?
Yeah, so DBT was created in the 70s by Dr. Marsha Lineman, and she it's kind of a runoff of CBT because it uses a lot of um, the same,
Methodology. Or...
yeah, the same self-talk and figuring out negative
Mhm.
thinking patterns and things like that. But it's really its main goals are to teach people how to live in the moment. So there's a lot of mindfulness involved
Mhm.
and finding your wise mind and walking the middle path, and to also develop healthy ways to cope with stress and regulate emotions. So in the schools, we use it in conjunction. We try and get families involved. So a family is working alongside a youth to build distress tolerance, and work on ways to walk the middle path. So, yes, it's true I'm having suicidal ideation, and it's also true that my life is worth living. And we
Mhm.
find that way to walk in the middle so that
Mm.
I can be okay and I can keep working on my things that I need to work on and not end my life.
Mm.
So that's kind of what that looks like in schools.
So DBT is useful for adults as well.
Yeah.
It's an
It's
actual
the only,
program
yeah,
that
it's the
you can
only
go through.
proven therapy that has been successful with borderline personality disorder.
Hmm.
And it's also used a lot with people suffering from eating disorders.
Mm.
Mm.
Interesting.
So DBT, I've had two people in my life go through the entire, it's like in a series, like an entire program for adults. And I have seen great progress in these two individuals over this time. One person that I know went through it twice. Um, and then they were told, you know, all the tools, you can't go through it a third time. You have to graduate from DBT. Uh, but both of my friends that have gone through it, one was suicidal most of her life, still has suicidal ideation, still struggles, but yet has massive, major helpful tools to help her navigate through, like you said, down the middle of not wanting to die and wanting to die. And so let's find a middle way. And also then a gentleman that I know has had great success. So that is something that we can really encourage our listeners, that if you want to explore DBT, talk to your licensed professional counselor, therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist that you're seeing, and have them refer you to a DBT specialist. And it could be very, very, very helpful. So, do you find parents being in the way?
Yes, but not very often. Most parents and caregivers really want the best for their kids, and you have to kind of wait them out sometimes, because when you tell a parent or a caregiver that their child is ill, it's scary. And
Yeah.
especially
Mhm.
mental illness, like, just it would be the same if you told a parent their child has cancer. Like, you don't know if they're going to get better or not.
Yeah.
It's really scary. So you kind of have to give them time and grace and give them information, and kind of, sometimes that relationship with the parent is an intervention in itself, because
Mm.
once you get that buy-in from parents, the world can change for that kid. And I think a lot of times I tell parents, like, your child is the exact same person they were before you heard this information. So your child
Mm,
hasn't changed. Nothing's different about them.
Mm.
It's just you are now different because you have this information.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
just reminding them that child's the same person with the
Mm.
same strengths and the same resiliencies and the same challenges. And now we know we have this information and we can continue to work together to help the child.
gosh, that was so good. Can I just take that and use that?
Sure.
Oh man. That is some things, when those things are said, your child is the same person that they were 5 minutes ago before you learn this new information. Sometimes we as parents, I get scared when my daughters, something happens, like physically. Oh my gosh, they're gonna die. We have to take them to the hospital. Um, my kids were sick. They had, colds, and they were just
Okay.
super sick. And those thoughts go through my mind of, how about if she gets really sick? So it is scary when you hear that your child is ill in any way.
Mhm.
And then to have a professional look at you and say, your child is at risk of mental illness,
Mhm.
that would just be a scary moment.
Yeah, and a lot of times there's guilt, um,
Mhm.
Mm,
because the parent feels like they did something wrong, or like if they would have done this differently, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. And sometimes that's true,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
most of the time it's not. And
Mm.
and even when it is true, typically it's not because the parent was trying to cause a mental illness. It was because they were doing their best, and they
Mhm.
weren't resourced or skilled, or didn't have, these people supporting them, and
right.
some system failed them at some point, and now, their child is
They had
suffering.
they had the tools that they had, and they were doing the best that they could.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think practitioners typically spend a lot of time, encouraging the parent,
Mm,
uh, letting them know that it's nobody's fault. It's not just like cancer, just like diabetes in children. It's not someone's fault. It's
right.
a disease, and now we know this information, and there's things we can do about it.
Hmm.
Right. Trey, you want to jump in on anything? Do you have any thoughts coming out?
I have a question, but it's not quite formed yet.
Okay.
I'm I'm curious about with a parent's experience. Like, do you find that um, after their child receives a diagnosis, do you find that parents are more interested in looking into their own mental health? Do you find
Mm,
yourself being able to provide more tools for parents?
Yeah, yeah. I think especially when a child starts um counseling or therapy, um usually the parent thinks that they're just going to send their child to
Mhm.
therapy, and the child
They'll
is
sit
going
in
to
the car and wait.
and then they realize, oh, like you want to see me too, because the way that I interact with my child, whether or not it was my fault, the way
Right.
that I interact with my child impacts the
Mhm.
way they
Right.
experience life, and I can do things different to help them be more successful.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
That's great.
yeah, I think a lot of parents think, yeah, it's going to be a their therapist and them thing, and then they realize it's like a family systems thing, and
Mhm.
Mhm.
it can help everybody. And then they're like, oh, I'm doing this because my parent did that, and then it kind of becomes like a snowball effect, and then a lot of people do seek their own treatment.
Mhm.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, with any therapy that I've done with my children, my own experience is eventually, if your counselor, your licensed professional counselor, is holistic about their approach, you're going to end up in that
chair.
counseling room eventually. You're going to be a part of it as a parent. Hey, we want to do a checkup with you and give you some information about your kid and how are you dealing with this and what are your challenges? And I end up in therapy myself when I go to the parent meeting. So eventually we're going to end up there at some point, either to help our children or to help ourselves. And so it's something that I think that we just need to talk about more, that it's okay to end up in counseling
Mm-hmm.
and it's okay to end up in a therapy, whether it be DBT or a traditional counseling therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also important to say that treatment is um, behind a lot of barriers for a lot of people. It
Mm.
costs a lot of money. Um,
Mhm.
it's not available on some insurance plans. There's huge wait lists.
Yes.
Uh,
There's a larger counseling facility near us, and I know that their wait list was almost a year and a half long,
mhm.
Mm.
and just severe shortage.
Yeah, and that's for everybody, and for kids that are really in crisis, like kids that are, have a suicide plan, their wait is 90 days before
Mm.
they can get into a provider. I mean, they can always go
Sure.
to a crisis clinic, but that's not someone that's gonna be having a relationship with them. And
Yeah.
um,
It might
so
get them
yeah,
9 days, but yeah.
yeah, it is a problem.
So let's talk about the obscure things. When I think about mental illness, I think about that person just walking down the street screaming at themselves or screaming at
Mhm,
the world.
mhm,
I think about the word schizophrenia.
mhm.
I think about the parent that kills their kids. So we always have these like extreme examples in our culture. What
Those
what
That was
causes?
extreme, yes.
Yeah, it is extreme. I think about the suicide, the person that I know that walked up onto the porch of their girlfriend's house and put a gun to their head and shot themselves in front of their girlfriend and mother. You know, these extreme cases of mental illness. Is Where does that come from? Help us to identify, because I don't want people to think, okay, I'm suffering from depression, I'm going to end up killing my family. So where does the
I don't want people to think that.
what did you say?
I said that's good that you don't want people to think that.
Yeah, I don't want people to think that. Um, but certain things can lead to that, and so is there a delineation between the extreme cases and the general? Is there like a general mental illness versus an extreme mental illness?
Yeah, so there's a different categories. So there's like a moderate mental illness and then a severe mental illness. The things you're talking about, um, are like sociopathic tendencies, and that is rare. Um, I don't have statistics before 2016, but it was about 1% of people with diagnosed mental illness had like a severe mental illness like that.
Okay.
And I think some things that can contribute to getting to that point is the average delay between the onset of mental illness and treatment is 11 years.
Wow.
Wow.
So
So the time that somebody starts experiencing just a general moderate mental illness
mhm,
to when they actually get help
mhm,
is 11 years
yeah.
average.
And those are the people that get treatment. So if you think
Right.
about that,
Right.
people that don't get treatment, so the
Mm,
people that don't have access to treatment are the people that have been told by the church that they shouldn't get treatment.
right.
Those
Right.
people are not getting treatment, and it is a snowball effect. It can, you are mentally ill, you have these experiences, you become more mentally ill until the point where you cannot be
Function.
in your own brain. It's no longer you.
Mm.
So there was
Jake has in there.
the idea I thought of is when I've read about schizophrenia in the past, it's been a early 20s to mid 20s experience where that's the most onset. Is that do you feel and find true with that, or are you seeing it younger and younger into children?
Yeah, it's much younger. I think um I think probably kids as young as like 9
Whoa.
have been
Mm.
diagnosed with schizophrenia. That could be wrong, but it's around that time, like early,
Mm-hmm.
like tween years. Um,
Mm.
and um, at this point, they haven't found a reason except for, um, undiagnosed and untreated traumatic experiences that have been um,
Suppressed and shoved.
suppressed and like ignored, because a
Yeah.
lot of kids that have that serious of mental illness have parents or caregivers that also have that
Mm.
Mm.
type of mental illness.
Right.
And as you probably know, our child protective services and human services are not the best social services, not because of ill intent, but because of funding and time and resources and
Mhm.
things like that. And the stress piles on, and the poverty piles on, and the oppression piles on, and the shame piles on, and then there isn't additional resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, so mental illness, it seems, has always, for history, has been underfunded, understaffed, underrecognized. But when it happens, when this goes undiagnosed for the 11 years and this person walks into a school and shoots it up, it's like, well, that has to be mental illness. And so we have to start addressing this at the core. And I wish that we would remove these stigmas and really focus on, okay, what are some causes, fault or no fault? What are the causes, and how can we get people some help? So with one of those trauma things, a child walks into you and they sit down and you say, hey, how's your day? I want to commit suicide. What do you say to them?
Do you have a plan?
Wow.
I know that sounds like super
Oh,
insensitive, but that's what I have to ask, because contrary to popular belief, talking about suicide or self-harm does not cause children to commit suicide or self-harm.
Right.
I need to be asked directly. It actually shows love and care when you ask
Absolutely.
directly. So I do. I normally, that's the first question that I would ask is, do you have a plan? And a lot of times their plan is very vague, or like, But when it's not very vague, when it's very specific and they have access to those things that they want to use, then there's different protocols and such. So
Mm.
um, yeah, so there's in schools there's a very very structured protocol with suicide screenings to be done by at least two mental health professionals,
Right.
and consultation with people and debriefing and parent contact and um, crisis center if necessary, depending on the level of severity, and
Mm.
an ongoing safety plan, ongoing counseling, and all of that.
And then self-harm, like
Mhm.
if a cutter, scratcher, what do you say to them?
Um, that is more. I definitely we definitely talk about suicide in that meeting. Self-harm is not typically considered suicidal ideation, depending on the harm, of course. If they're
Right.
cutting their throat, that's a little bit different. But cuts on the wrist, things like that, it's a numbing sensation, just like drinking or sex or alcohol, drugs. It's something to numb emotional pain.
Mm.
So that's often where that conversation goes, with other supports, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of drug use are you seeing in the schools right now? Like we live in the Portland metro area. And so what are the whole fentanyl conversation is out there. What are you seeing kids like getting into now? What is the drug of choice?
Um, the word on the streets is there's a lot of pot and
Yeah.
shrooms, and there's definitely like harder drugs, um, but they are very like hush hush. There's a whole like system and situation, and like there's TikTok and Snapchat and all these things that are really hard to um, figure out where it's coming from. There's kids that have drug dealers show up there at their houses because they message them on TikTok, or
Wow.
so it's pretty different than when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah. You can just call Grubhub now and get your pot at your door,
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
I
The
didn't mean to say Grubhub out loud, but no, nothing against them.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a definite increase and rise in substance abuse disorders in younger and younger children. So we
Mm.
say like pot's not addictive, but when you start smoking pot or eating edibles at when you're in 6th or 7th grade, and you continue to do that all day, every day, you become addicted, and it might not be to the substance, but it's definitely to that
Euphoria.
feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
the euphoria, the numbness, um, so and then when that doesn't work anymore, then you find something else that does. Um, yeah, so
With this, what type of resources have gotten better since you've started? Do you feel like there's something you point to and it's like this has actually gotten better?
like with drugs specifically,
Well,
or
drugs, like anything that we've talked about so far.
yeah, I um, I think one of the big things is that addition of social workers in schools.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
My district employs social workers at every building, and they're very helpful in engaging with families and finding
Mm.
outside of school supports for families, meeting basic needs,
Mm-hmm.
so that parents can focus on their child's health.
Mm.
So if they have food and rent, they can more likely focus on their child's health
Yeah.
than they're
Gosh.
always at work. So I think that's been a big improvement overall. And then we also have um, drug and alcohol counselors that we can refer to for kids that are really struggling. We
Mm.
have the Hawthorne Walk-in Clinic, which isn't school-based, but
Mm-hmm.
we refer a lot of families there.
Mm.
And there's a lot more outside agencies that have partnered with schools, um, and made it easier for the school teams to speak with the providers and outside agencies to collaborate on care plans and safety plans and all of those things.
So let's talk about LGBTQIA+. So a child comes in, they're young. Let's say they're 11, 12, maybe younger. And I don't know how they would articulate it to you, but they come out either as gay to you, or they come out as trans, or they might say, I'm experiencing this feeling of being the opposite gender of what I am, or a different gender than what I am. What is the best for parents? What would you recommend for somebody like me that, okay, I have this child that just came out. What do you say to the child? What's the best course of action? Stimulus, pause, then respond?
Yeah. So like as a parent, you're saying, or as a caregiver of a child.
Yeah. Yes.
So I have some
But
do's
also
and
also what you say too. Like how do you, what's your
If you
course of
can
action?
say that. I'm
Yeah,
not sure if you can.
Yeah.
yeah. So what I say is very affirming of a child's identity. I feel very fortunate to work in a state where we can say gay. And I would never work in a state where we couldn't. I think that is a huge civil rights violation. Anyway, in Oregon, we do not have to share a child's shared gender identity or sexual identity with the family if the child doesn't want it to be shared, unless there's a situation in which the child would be harmed if we didn't share it.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets tricky, and I personally, I am always working with the child to support them and help them to come to a point where they can come out to their family, because I think that's really important, especially as the child gets older. And I've been in a situation where I've offered to like Zoom with the family so that I can be there with the child when they tell their parent. And luckily and fortunately, I've had really good experiences with that.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of kids haven't had good experiences with that because they've told me about it. So
Right.
your parents or caregivers, if your child at any age comes out as whatever, so do's and don'ts. Do thank them for telling you. Do ask them how you can support them. And do seek support for yourself, because you will feel some way about it, no matter how woke you are. You'll feel a way. And
Yeah.
if your child is older and it's more likely that this is really who they are, you will have grief about the life you thought they would have, and the life the easier way that it would be for them. So seek support for yourself. Don't, please, this is gonna be hard.
So the
Don't tell
do's and now the don'ts. So we're going to go over don'ts.
don't.
Yeah.
This is much more difficult. Don't tell them it's just a phase. Even if they're 8 years old, don't tell them it's a phase. It might be, but you don't need to tell them that. They'll figure it out. Don't tell them, no, you're not, or are you sure? Because if they're telling you, especially if they're telling you after an amount of time, and they do the whole like, mom, sit down, I need to tell you something. It's because they believe this about themselves, and they need you to believe it too.
Enough to actually make that important. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't ignore it. And by ignore, I mean don't act like it's not a big deal. Like, oh, okay, sure. because that's just, dismissive, and
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to tell you something really important. And what if this is their only coming out story and that's how you reacted? Like, you want them to remember this as something positive. Like,
Mhm.
I told my parents a really, really big thing and they didn't care.
Yeah.
So just think about that. And then please don't use religion or personal belief to shame them.
Mm,
Yep.
That's great. Thank you.
very
Wonderful.
good. So I have not personally experienced that with my children, but I've walked alongside parents that have,
Mhm.
and many times, because we have, you in our lives, and we have, other people like you in our lives that have coached us on how to talk and respond and guide, somebody that is coming out, which has been very helpful to have a community of people around somebody like me. It's like, how do I respond to this as a pastor? How do I respond to this as, a friend? Um, I've also, in my olden days,
Your
been a part
golden
of those
years.
olden years. Yeah, been a part of those conversations, and they have not gone well at all. And today, I don't have relationships with those people because of those conversations. Uh, but today, because of the do's, because we did these other things, I do have relationships with these people. And I think what you're saying is that how we respond builds trust, how we respond builds safety, how we respond builds love and care, so that if it is a phase or if it is a moment, they go through and journey through that moment, and they're able to tell you other things as a parent or a friend or a pastor. Um,
Exactly.
and we need to create those environments for our children, because they're going to come out not in necessarily in a gay or LGBTQIA way, but they're going to admit some things to us in the future to honor the language of coming out for being gay and admitting other things, that we need to create environments that would help them to share. Do you think that when we respond in very negative ways, that could potentially put that child at risk of mental illness?
100%. If you're your child's security, and if
Mhm.
you have something wrong with who they are as a human being, like, think of how harmful that is, and think of
Mhm.
how hurtful that could be. Your
Mm,
parent is refusing to acknowledge your existence in the way that you see yourself, even if it's a phase.
right,
Yeah.
That
right.
doesn't matter. It's in
That's
the
the phase they're
moment.
in. Yeah.
In the moment of that 11-year-old's life or 15-year-old's life, that is truth to them, and you're denying their truth.
Mm,
Mm.
And it wouldn't matter as much if a classmate said it or a teacher said it or someone on the
Mhm.
street said it, but you as their security and their provider, and the
Mhm.
first and best relationship they have likely says that you don't acknowledge them, or you don't believe them, or you don't think
mhm,
it's okay. Um, it's just it's very damaging.
mm,
Mhm.
definitely.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that from anybody else? Okay.
Nothing new. I just really appreciate what Tiffany had to say.
Totally. 100%.
I was
I
trying to
think
answer
we live in a culture today that, um, we need to have learned from the last, 100 years of how to respond differently and to create environments differently when it comes to these really um, uh, crucible moments in people's lives, and also difficult topics to talk about with, like, mental illness. We need to create a different culture around it. So as a pastor, I need to ask you, like from my perspective, looking at a faith community, how can the church respond better to these topics? Give us some advice. Like if you were speaking authoritatively into the church right now, what would you say?
I think this, like talking about it and being unapologetic about it, like we stand in support of mental health care. We stand in support of LGBTQ. We, you know, we don't care about anything else except for a human being and you're here. Like that's what we care about. Um I think like your apology meant something. Um I'm it's frustrating that it probably isn't going to be said in other spaces, but I think that is huge. Like just acknowledging that there are people that are not here anymore because and I don't mean like not here, like not in the church. I mean like not here, like dead,
Right.
because they were turned away and their
Mhm.
mental health didn't matter enough um, to the church to be cared for, and they kind of went by the wayside, and that's on us. Like that's on the people of Jesus in the
Yeah.
United States, um, and that's I mean it's really um, discouraging. And I think that in my own life, I know several people that have turned away from the church because
Mhm.
their mental health wasn't acknowledged, or because they were told to go off of their medication, or they were told that no, you can't put your kid on medication. You just need to pray about it. Um,
Mm, yeah.
Mm.
I know somebody personally that was asked or was told from a pulpit to go off their medication, and they did, and it wrecked his existence. He just went just totally deep into mental illness. It was scary. And
mhm,
he just thought it was the right thing to do because the pastor in authority was speaking this word of knowledge from God, and it came from the Holy Spirit. And we use our power sometimes, and and even in probably, let's give positive intent, the pastor didn't know and they didn't, figure it out. Well, we can't say things that we don't know, and we
mhm,
can't just come out and never apologize,
Mhm.
for saying those things too and taking them back. So if there's pastors out there, if you listen to this through the week, if you've said something from your pulpits about mental illness and LGBTQIA plus, and you have really spoken out against certain things, it is time to apologize. And it is time to get up in our pulpits and say, I am sorry. I need to take something back. I said this a year ago. It is not true. This is what is true. There's a movie out right now called The Jesus Revolution, and it's about the Calvary Chapel and the Jesus movement out of the late 60s and early 70s. And everyone's all excited about this movie, and all my conservative Christian friends are like, yeah, go see the Jesus Revolution, it's amazing. But there's a person in the movie that's depicted who was a
Mhm.
real person. His name was Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie Frisbee was the evangelist that came alongside Chuck Smith and invited all the hippies off the beaches into the Jesus Revolution. He was the big gatherer of all the hippies, and he brought thousands and thousands and thousands of people to faith, to Christ, baptized them into the ocean, brought them under the tent of Calvary Chapel, and they started an entire huge movement all over the United States and really all over the world. I think they have, between the Vineyard and Calvary Chapel, both movements came out of Lonnie Frisbee's work. And um, and over the course of his ministry, at some point, somebody found out that he was gay, and they kicked him out. They kicked him out of the church. They excommunicated him from both movements, and he then lost his way and went off and actually contracted AIDS and died in the early 90s. And died tragically. And to think about the difference that those churches could have made in Lonnie Frisbee's life if they would have just accepted him at the table too. Along with all his hippie friends, they could have accepted him too as well. And so I think that we really need to think about these things in our ministries. All right, let's do a quick little
Good.
rapid fire. If anyone has any
I
thoughts,
have
Shreya?
one more thing.
I
Oh,
do.
please,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I throw something at you, Tiffany, real quick? That's
Sure.
off script. So, being a counselor, and especially a clinician like you are, is especially draining. What do you do for your own self-care?
Ooh, I hate when people ask me this because I'm really
I'm
bad
sorry. Oh gosh.
No, I go through phases. I'm a
Okay.
normal human.
Yeah.
I sometimes am really good about taking care of myself, and when I say taking care of myself, I mean like getting enough sleep, exercising, going to the doctor when I need to go to the doctor, like going to my checkups and going to the dentist. Those are things that sometimes get neglected when we're busy, and I think they're very very important. And if you have access to them, you should use them. And connection is really important to me, connection with my own family. And I often won't talk about work when I'm at home because I like to compartmentalize it. And I have a really great support network and professional colleagues that I talk with about cases. So I feel supported at work and I leave it there, or I try to. I can't always do that. But yeah, that's what I do
Good,
to
thank
stay
you.
healthy.
Thanks.
I want to
think
go back
mine's-
to.
Oh, no, go ahead, Shreya.
I'm changing the topic. So,
Yeah.
okay, changing the topic back to how the church can respond. I was thinking about the barriers to treatment that we talked about, and so one, what are some ways you think the church could step in and help with those barriers? And then two, what are some things that we as lay people can do to support someone while they're not able to access the services that they need?
Those are good questions. I was thinking about this earlier. I think if your church can at all have some type of resource booklet or a page on their website that lists vetted mental health clinics or places that you know of that accept different types of insurances in your community, I think that could be really helpful for people and being able to like direct people to that. Because when you are feeling overwhelmed with your life and you are experiencing mental illness, finding a mental health provider is really, really overwhelming. So any help that the church can give in that area, whether it be like I said, like a resource guide or a time that you set aside, like certain people set aside to help people navigate health insurance and things like that. Don't start a counseling department unless you have professional licensed therapists in your congregation that want to, volunteer their time. But I've seen a lot of like, especially big churches have counseling departments, and it always felt really
Cultic.
yeah, just kind of icky. Like, do these people know they're not actually going to a counselor? It's kind of deceptive. And I feel like I would hope that those people know that if there's something serious that they need to refer out to, they would, but I don't always think that would be the case. And then people to support friends going through mental illness. I think checking in, just kind of like the same things we did for people during COVID, like checking in, um, doing things for them without being asked to do them. Because again, if you're having a mental illness experience, and someone says, "What can I do for you?" That's really overwhelming. And people don't really have an answer to that all the time. So doing things, saying, "Hey, I'm going to be at your house at 5 and we're going to go for a walk." And if
Mm.
you get there and they don't answer the door, then go in, and make sure they're okay. But
Mhm.
also, there's, offering to call someone with someone, the crisis line, if they're in crisis,
Yeah.
um, being there in the room with them while they do that, or helping them find a mental health provider, if they're not able to do that because they're just feeling very overwhelmed, or babysitting for them so that they can attend a session, or letting them use your laptop so they can Zoom with BetterHelp or something like that.
That's what I asked.
Mm.
Do you point people to online, or do you majority point people to in person?
A lot of providers have moved to have a virtual option, and I think that's been really beneficial. Doesn't work for
Mhm.
everybody. Um, and there are like big companies, like BetterHelp, where you can
Mhm.
like just like text with someone, and I've heard good things.
Mhm.
I don't think like those people are all licensed and they're all professional providers, so I think if that was your only way to get in, through one of those services, I think that would be at least a good starting point, um, while you
I've
were on.
used it. It's very helpful. I've used it myself.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful if you don't have the capacity to like
Yeah.
be looking through
I
websites
think
and all that.
yeah, I think too that if you can't find one locally that has BetterHelp, or Talkspace is another one that's like a
Mm,
vetted resource.
right.
Yes, and let's make sure to really emphasize. I am sure that there are online quote counselors that are providing services. If they do not have a licensed professional counseling licensure attached to their name and they're out on these websites providing services, please do not go onto those. Go on to things like betterhelp.com or ones that would have a licensure attached to their name, a licensed professional counselor. Can we put some of these resources in our comment box? Because I think that those are some real, like just betterhelp.com. And what was that, Talking Space, Jake? There's another one called
Talkspace,
Talking
yeah.
Space. Talkspace. Okay.
Talkspace, yeah.
Talkspace. I think those are good. Sherry, did you have another question? You're just you answered that one. Did you have one more?
It was a two-powder, and Tiffany got there.
Okay, good. Awesome. Well, as it's 9:21, let's go to our little rapid fire. And uh, we've answered some of these, but I want to get your just initial response, um, because these things have stigma around them, and some of them are toxic, some of them are not toxic. So I want to get your just opinion on antidepressants.
Very helpful and should be used in conjunction with therapy.
Hmm.
Okay, very important, very helpful, used in conjunction with uh, with therapy. EMDR therapy.
Um, Controversial and not based in research, but
Whoa.
has been very helpful for some people.
That's
That's
when they
new.
take a light and you follow the eyes back and forth and you retell certain trauma, reframe different
Mhm.
things. Gender dysphoria as a mental illness.
Ooh. Well, Okay, so gender dysphoria is when a person experiences distress because they don't feel like their body matches their identity that they feel.
Okay.
Um, so if I guess like it can cause a mental illness because of the dissatisfaction and depression that they feel that their appearance doesn't match their true feeling, but questioning your own body or feeling like your parts don't match your gender is not a mental illness.
So gender is a social construct, and it has gender is on a spectrum in a
Mhm.
cultural context, but
Mhm.
also biological sex is also on a spectrum because we have 42 or 52, can't remember if it's 42 or 52, I'll have to look that up, of different genetic combination of X and Y,
Yep.
XXX,
I think it's
XYY, XXY. There's just multiple combinations of that. So we need to be very careful about how we speak about such things. Christian counseling.
This is my face showing how I feel. I feel like it can be very problematic when a counselor chooses to only use sorry, I feel like it can be like an ethical violation when a counselor chooses to only provide Christian-based counseling services, depending on their Christian orientation, if that makes sense. So if they're very
Mhm.
conservative and
Mm-hmm.
are one of those people that happen to have a mental health license and they're a mental health practitioner, but their personal beliefs get in the way of um, their
Practice.
therapy
Yeah.
practice, that can be an ethical violation, in my opinion. Um,
Mm.
and I feel like as a counselor or therapist, you could just work with Christians because they need therapy. I don't feel like you need to be a Christian counselor.
Right. Conversion therapy.
Awful and has caused a lot of pain for many people. And the person that invented it has um, apologized, and he is a out gay person, and he feels very deep shame about what he has done to people in the name of God.
Yeah. And being triggered.
I think that term is really overused.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that people are triggered by things. Um, and it can be a sign of, I need to look inside myself because something just happened. And I'm having a physiological reaction to it. Um, and then
Mm-hmm.
also being able to be brave enough to avoid things that are going to put your mental health in a tailspin. So, like, for example, you shouldn't do EMDR if you're like in the moment experiencing trauma. Like, that's not a good fit
Mm.
for you.
Right.
Um, that would be a trigger. Um,
Mm.
if you are suffering from PTSD and loud noises bother you, you shouldn't go to a fireworks show. Um,
Right. But
so
we
yeah.
use the word triggered overused, like I'm
Oh
just triggered by everything.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. When I
And
get
we
into an uncomfortable situation, I
uh,
say I'm triggered. Or if somebody walks in and they say a couple of very uh, political type statements, I say I'm triggered and I
uh,
have to leave. Um,
yeah.
well, I really appreciate your work. Um, and more importantly, I appreciate who you are as a human being. And I'm really thankful that you joined us tonight and that our listeners got to just peer in a little bit and participate just by hearing this information. We find this information important, and just the practice of talking about it. We're not claiming to be professionals as the constructionists. We're not claiming to be practitioners. We just want to openly talk about such topics to get information that is helpful and useful and also responsible. And so in our comments section, we have a couple of things that we want you to maybe do some deep dives for yourself. If you want to go to Talkspace.com to look into online therapy, BetterHelp.com, looking into online counseling. There's also a couple of other links that we posted. There's the new CDC report out for children on screen time and the effect of screen time on mental illness. And so that's a brand new report that came out February 27th. It's a New York Times article about the report. And so know that it's written by a journalist, but it is backed by some data that is from the CDC. So they just released that report, screen time over the last decades of children's mental health. So Talkspace.com, BetterHelp.com, just learning how to be a mindful and a parent that pays attention. I would say we need to pay attention to our children's mental health. We don't need to deny it. We don't need to tell them that what they're experiencing is not real, no matter what it is. We need to create spaces that are healthy and safe for our children to be vulnerable with us, and that we can find the right resources for them. Just know that you and me as a parent, we do not have all the equipment and the tools to help all the problems that our children face. And so therapy for our children is important, useful, and we want to encourage that as well, not just for ourselves as adults, but also for our children. And we can advocate for our children in these ways. And so I'm really glad that Tiffany, you joined us. Thank you for being here with us. And we hope that this message of mental illness and mental health goes out to as many people as possible. So if you wanted to share this episode, everybody that's listening tonight, share this episode with people just to get this information into their hands. We find it useful, and we hope that people will be on their journey to mental health. So with that, good night, everybody. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Sharaya, for participating and joining us and being a part of this. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.